it's possible for a powerful player to, in theory, make something open, but not actually be doing it in a way that's supposed to serve the end goal of like collaborative, deliberative public input into how something is designed for the public benefit, and instead is doing it more in a way that it benefits themselves.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Kevin Frazier, a Arbel Fellow at Lawfare, with Chinny Sharma, Associate Professor at Fordham Law School, and Yonathan Arbel, Co-Director of the Center for Law and AI Risk and Associate Professor at Alabama Law.
If we take these concerns seriously, there is a reason to worry about the free dissemination of models to every person on the planet, no matter their set of values, their commitments, and their goals.
Today, we're talking about open source AI, its meaning, its costs and benefits, and its future amid an uncertain regulatory environment.
A tale as old as tech is the struggle to democratize access to the latest innovations while also making sure that access to technology is sufficiently regulated. A new chapter in that tale has unfolded. Depending on who you ask, open source AI might be increasing the odds of catastrophic risk, a praiseworthy example of the democratization of AI, or something in need of more clarification. We're going to try to get to the root of what open source AI means, the legal and policy ramifications of open source AI, and some predictions about where AI development and deployment may be headed. Chinny, let's start with you. Can you speak to the idea of what open source means generally? Folks may be familiar, for example, with Mozilla's Firefox and some of these other broader notions of open source. When they think about open source, what are they thinking of?
So when folks think about open source and we think of things like Mozilla, we're often thinking about kind of the GUI or the graphic user interface that we as a user might interact with. But really what open source is the body or corpus of code that creates things like Mozilla Firefox. And that corpus of code is made available online for anyone to access in a restriction-free way, which means that you can take it, you can copy it, you can edit it, you can make changes to it. Some open source licenses, and I want to be very clear that there are a lot of different open source licenses. Some are more permissive than others. Some will even allow you to commercialize your use of open source code. But while I explain what open source code is, I also want to emphasize the magnitude of it. Well over 95% of every line of code out there today is open source. Linux operating systems, Apache's kind of like helps run the supercomputers that we use for many of the things that run today's society. A lot of our critical infrastructure all relies on open source software. So that basically means that I, as developer at X company, that I guess I can't say X company as in like a generic company anymore.
Maybe go with Y or Z, just any other letter. There's so many other letters.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say Alpha company, and I was like, that also doesn't work anymore. Random company, Chinny, developer at Random Company, is told to build a feature. I might have a general sense of how I want to build it. But generally what my first step is going to be is to look online at open source libraries that are doing a lot of what I want to do, see if either I can learn from that and build it myself, or more likely copy that code, use it, and then adapt it for my needs, and then put it into the proprietary software that Random Company has asked me to build.
I think you're moving us in the right direction. And in particular, you flagged that there's a little bit or a lot of bit of ambiguity in this space about what precisely open source means. So, Yonathan, now you get to add to that ambiguity. Can you tell us about open source in the context of AI? There's a lot of different definitions about what exactly constitutes open source AI. Bloom from Hugging Face, for example, is defined as an open access model. Meanwhile, some say that Meta's Llama model is open source. Others disagree. Can you clarify a little bit about what the heck all of these different open, and for those listeners, I did just use air quotes, and unfortunately you don't get the gloriousness of my beautiful air quotes, but can you tell us what the heck open source means in the AI context?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll pick up where Chinny left off, because we're now we have a map of where we are. I think in software, we used to distinguish between source code and object code, where the object code would be this sort of list of instructions that you look into. It's very difficult to decipher what's going on inside. So I remember sort of growing up, buying video games and trying to hack them and, get myself more HP. And you go inside the files, and what you read it's just incomprehensible. It's just letters and numbers. It's very difficult to understand. That's the object code. The source code would be the sort of more higher level version of the code, where if you have some coding experience, you should be able to read through and understand what's going on. And the reason why I bring up this distinction is because we're trying to see these sort of spectrums in AI models as well, where there are things that are given freely. People can use them for free. And there is this old saying in open source, free as in freedom of speech, not as in free beer. And the notion is that it's not just enough for the software, the code, the AI model to be free, to be able to be used free of charge. It's also important that you will have access to a deeper understanding of the model. So there are three important distinctions that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about open source AI models. The first is the lowest, narrowest sense of the word, where the model, the weights, basically are distributed free of charge. You don't know what's going on inside, just like the games I used to crack. You read them, you see numbers, but you don't exactly know what they mean. And it's harder for you to manipulate or change or modify the weights. Not impossible, but difficult. There is a higher level of openness where you get to know how the model was trained. You get access to the actual training code. And that's very important because then you learn about the architecture. You learn all the nifty tricks that developers have put in. We know a lot about GPT-4, but we really don't know a whole lot, officially at least, about its architecture. And then there is the final level of openness, and maybe the most ambitious and unrealistic one, where you also have open access to the data used to train the model. And that's problematic for some models because they are trained on proprietary data sets.
Perfect. So we've got this spectrum of openness from having open weights like Llama to having open weights, open data, and perhaps even open training like Bloom from Hugging Face. Chinny, what's the rationale behind why we see this spectrum of openness, and why would a lab decide that they wanted to land on a specific place in that spectrum?
Yeah, it's a great and incredibly complicated question, and I feel like maybe I'll get us 25 to 30% of the way to a satisfactory answer there. I think that we keep debating this and have been debating it for decades, but the binary between open and closed, as Yonathan mentioned, is not really a binary. It's more of a spectrum. As you said, there's a difference between open source and open access. Even in the open source community, there's free software versus free and open source software, and the Libra movement. All of which is to say, there are big pros to opening something up, and there are also pros to keeping it very close hold and withheld from the general public. And I'll start with the latter because I think in today's capitalist society, we generally default to thinking that something of value is going to be something that someone has clear, defined property rights over. And in the US legal system, property rights include the right to exclude. And what that means is this is mine and you can't have it. And when that comes to open source software, whether open source AI or not, the reason people want it to be closed is because they don't want others to have the benefit of seeing how they built the really cool thing that they built. They also don't want others to have the ability to change, whether to worsen or improve what it is that they've built. So you'll see this in the hardware world. There's a big right to repair movement where people are frustrated that certain tech companies are not allowing third-party vendors to come in and repair their computer system. So for example, a John Deere tractor. The reason they say they don't want third parties to come and repair things is, well, they're going to come in and they're going to see the secret sauce of how we built this. And so we're the only ones that should be allowed to repair our own systems. So that's kind of the justification for keeping things close hold or closed. To make something open, though, and I will kind of come in wearing my bias on my sleeve if I am extremely pro the open source world movement ethos. I think it is the reason the tech world has developed the way it is, the reason we have an internet infrastructure. I think it is a very fundamental part of how we have an internet that is, as at least in theory, democratized as it is. That being said, why would somebody open something up? At core, there is a sense of altruism. Somebody writes something useful. They think maybe other people would find this useful. They put it up on GitHub or whatever other hosting platform of your choice, and they say maybe somebody else can use this. Altruism is kind of maybe the lowest common denominator. I do think a lot of open source developers see kind of there is an ethic there. There is a sense of morality of we think this information is something that one person can't hold. It's available for everyone. There's 3 academics on this call. I think that we know that academics also feel strongly that information and knowledge is something that should be shared, not withheld. But then there's also the kind of more pragmatic motivations of, okay, well, I'm building this thing, but I'm really incredible at building this one part of this thing, but I'm not a security person. I don't know how to secure my software. So then I make this open source, and then I invite other people who might be security experts to come in and say, you've left open this like gaping vulnerability here, or here's an unpatched component that would actually be quite critical for you to patch. And then now I can crowdsource talent that I don't have myself from somebody else. And I don't need to go out and go through the arduous HR process of hiring them. This can just be someone who I organically get connected to online that can come and help with this. And to not kind of belabor the point more and more, but these communities can grow massive. So right now, like OpenSSL is a huge crypto library that has helped support and secure websites for decades on the internet. There is a large number of people that contribute to that to help improve it, to kind of continue to scan the code, make sure there aren't big errors. If there are errors, they post a ticket. They say like, hey, people who are managing this library, there's something wrong. You should fix it. Some people will even propose to fix themselves. It's a share the labor, reap the benefits, share the labor kind of a model. And you can see with open source why this would be extremely valuable. It is extremely time and resource intensive to build powerful open source technologies. It is also something that not as many people have the talent or expertise to do it. And so if I feel like I've read enough Medium articles that I have a general sense of how to kind of use TensorFlow to build something cool, doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to like bring whatever incredible image of my get rich quick startup idea to reality by myself, but I can post something up there online and see if other people can jump in, take what little I started, and then move forward with that. So hopefully that kind of helped explain why people might move open to closed.
Chinny, just one thing I want to drill down on real quick would be this notion of democratization, because these two concepts get thrown together quite a bit in terms of openness
Yes.
and democratization, where use of one of those phrases makes the public, I'd argue, have this sort of positive feeling towards something that's more open or more democratic. Generally, in American society, in addition to being pro-property rights, we're also pretty celebratory of democracy and openness. But there have been concerns that some companies, mainly Meta, have been using this label of open source as a form of open washing. Can you help us understand what this open washing concern might pertain to and why it may be open washing to begin with?
Absolutely. Again, there's so many levels of complexity here, but I'll try to keep it relatively simple. It's that, yes, when you make something open, when I create a community garden and I say anyone can come help plant and anyone can reap the fruit from this community garden, that's great. That means that we think of it as like, well, now the public can decide, do we want more strawberries or more tomatoes? Like we've got a democratic approach to resource allocation, labor distribution. Social norms are going to dictate like this family of 9 might be able to get more from the community garden than this single person who's living by themselves. Whatever. That's kind of the general idea behind openness, and open projects can lend themselves to those same structures, which is why we think of it as like a democratized approach. Whereas conversely, if I Schmegman's am a supermarket that has my own proprietary garden, I have complete top-down control over what gets planted, what gets reaped, what the price it gets sold at, how much I'm going to sell it at, whether the price at this one location is different from the price at a different location. That's unilateral decision-making control. And the alternative in the open model is more of a kind of communal deliberative process, like the public kind of controls it. Now, there have been pushes to make the internet more open because, as we know today, there are a few companies, and I'm not going to kind of like invoke legal antitrust language, but I will say that in terms of market share, reputational awareness, they have a dominant hold over like the public's imagining of who runs tech. Like we all know the Googles and the Microsofts and the Apples. Fewer people know the DuckDuckGos. And we are concerned about the lack of democratization there is because we don't get a lot of input into how Google designs search results. And many have complained about that over the years. So instead of getting kind of consumer input, we are kind of on the receiving end of what companies want to do. Now, if we take that to the AI world, a more democratized approach to AI would be, well, me and my 15 cishet white men have decided we want to build our model in this particular way, but we've made it open. And then one of the many incredible nonprofit teams of POC and other minority-driven engineering groups come in and say, like, look at these massive blind spots you have. Like, let us identify these for you and suggest ways you can improve that. That's what an open world can allow for. Now, what is open washing? As with anything, like we see this in the environmental or sustainability world, you can just use the right keywords to make it sound like you're doing really good things without actually doing the good things. And so it's possible for a powerful player to, in theory, make something open, but not actually be doing it in a way that's supposed to serve the end goal of like collaborative, deliberative public input into how something is designed for the public benefit, and instead is doing it more in a way that it benefits themselves. Now, like, again, I try to use non-tech analogies when I explain these things, but like, let's go back to the communal garden. Say like Schmegman's, the big supermarket, created a massive communal garden and was like, here's this free land and these resources, and you guys should figure out like, what you want to plant and what you want to reap, but it uses that actually to do research. Oh, it seems like this particular fruit is much more popular in this area, and this is the demand of this. And by kind of making a small plot of land available, now all of a sudden they have so much business insight into specifically how they can serve this community. And because they were the ones that theoretically made this community garden open, they can close at any point they want. And so now overnight, community garden is closed. But Schmegman's knows that strawberries are more popular than blackberries. We're going to increase our production of strawberries, and we're going to improve our profits in that way. And so the concern about Facebook open washing its release of Llama is it did it in this very haphazard way of, we're going to require you to explain that you're a researcher using this for research purposes, but once you check those boxes, we'll hand over all of the code to you that we have, and do with it what you will. There's no enforcement on the back end. So obviously everyone on the internet that wanted access to the code had access to that code. But what does that give Facebook? It gives Facebook a lot of insight into, what are people doing with this? How are they tinkering with it? Which are these like derivative models based on Llama that are becoming really popular? Why are they becoming popular? Who are the types of people that are contributing to this? And like we see this with Amazon, when you have third-party small businesses that sell things on Amazon, Amazon sees what's trending, builds the Amazon version of that product, and then that one underprices the others and starts selling better than everything else. Now, Facebook has made something available. It's basically doing in-the-field research with everyone having access to this. I have no doubt that we're going to come out with new models down the road that have learned from all of this business intelligence they've been gathering.
Well, Chinny, if you thought you would only get us 25 to 30% of the way to understanding, you vastly underestimate your teaching abilities. I am envious of all of your students. Yonathan, we obviously have a lot to break down following those excellent remarks. Where do you want to jump in here first before we move on to some of the risks associated with open source models?
I think I generally agree that The reasons why some models are being open sourced, open washed, it's sort of a normative statement of evaluation of how we feel about that, have to do with research into the applications, training techniques. What the community has done with Llama 3 and the various other models is just mind-blowingly impressive. And this is talent that would not have been available to Meta or any of the other labs. Just people around the world who are just contributing and doing amazing things that advance, tinker, break apart, identify vulnerabilities, biases, all these sort of things. And I would not want to discourage companies from doing halfway measures, because we do learn from that, even us. It's not just them learning about us. We also learn about them, and we learn about the vulnerabilities. So not that Chinny necessarily presented a one-sided picture, not at all, but I just want to emphasize the fullness of this, which I think we agree on.
I totally agree. Yeah. And I should have also mentioned that as well, of one of the huge values of openness is the transparency that third parties get into the very important technology that's impacting their lives. It allows people like, Kevin, Yonathan, and I to kind of look over how something is built to see whether that we have concerns under perhaps anti-discrimination law. It allows other tech experts to review something and say, here are some gaping security holes. It allows people from, for example, the global South's markets that, we have huge blind spots towards, to say, this is going to hugely disrupt this cultural norm that you have no awareness of. So yeah, there's, I'm so glad you brought that up, Yonathan. I do not want to sound like the only reason to make something open is to benefit the private company.
So we've broken down this binary in terms of open closed and introduced some new layers to openness to begin with, and also explored a lot of the positive associations with openness and democratization. Yonathan, you and I, as well as our colleague Peter Slib, as directors of the Center of Law and AI Risk, have publicly shared our concerns about some of the risks associated in particular with open source AI models. Now, we just heard all of these benefits about experimentation and positive use cases. Why the heck are we concerned about open source AI models? What are some of those chief concerns that folks may have?
Yes. So I think the starting point is, at least for me, and I think for most of us, is that we truly love the open source spirit. So objections, concern, and risk assessment has nothing to do with sort of any sort of systematic objection to sort of bottom-up initiatives that are amazing. But there are two broad categories of risk that people are concerned about. The first is sort of ethical risks, that I think Chinny sort of emphasized, where models can be used to make biased decisions, to produce toxic outputs, to be offensive, to create misinformation. All of these ways to abuse the systems in ways that will interfere with the lives of people. This is a cause for concern with any AI model. The second set of concerns is the concerns that fall under the heading of safety. The concern that a sophisticated AI model can be the cause of a large-scale calamity or social disruption. So here we would worry about things like if we install AI in all of our critical infrastructure, and then one day, for various reasons, maybe because of an attack by an adversary, maybe because the system is seeing some new input that it was not trained on, whatever the case may be, if things go crazy, then the harm can be very, very significant. So ethical concerns and safety should be on our mind when we think about very sophisticated AI systems. And we are now at a point where the AI systems are not truly dangerous. We've had some time to play around with GPT-3, 2, 3, 4, all the various other models. There are problems with all of them, and we've learned about the problems. But so far, there has not been a sort of major breakdown or major harm to human lives. But we worry that it might happen. And if you take this set of concerns seriously enough, you want to maintain a degree of control. The problem with open source is that there is no shutdown button. There is no recall on a defective model. If your car is shown to have some unanticipated safety risk, you can recall it and have it fixed. When you have an open source model that is risky or dangerous, there is no recall button. And that is the source of concern. This has to be balanced against all the many beautiful things that open source can help us understand. Some of the advantages of open source also have to do with improving our understanding of safety. So it's not just one-sided argument, but at the very least, if we take these concerns seriously, there is a reason to worry about the free dissemination of models to every person on the planet, no matter their set of values, their commitments, and their goals.
So going back to Chinny's example of this kind of communal garden, Yonathan, if I'm understanding you correctly, we're kind of segmenting between, in this community garden space, we may want to open source, for lack of a better phrase, a shovel, right? We're fine with all gardeners having a shovel. We might be more concerned with all gardeners having access to slug poison, right? Some folks might know how to use that appropriately. Other folks may really hate the carrots that their neighbor's growing and intentionally destroy those carrots, or come up with whatever garden metaphor you want. So is the focus here really on distinguishing between highly capable AI models versus, let's say, less advanced models that may not pose the same amount of threat? In other words, is there some argument to be made that open sourcing is really only an issue for the most advanced models?
Ideally, the answer would have been yes. I want the answer to be yes, that we can safely draw a line and say safe models, unsafe models, regulate these carefully, and just freely distribute all the other ones. The problem is exactly what we've seen in the open source community is the genius of the community. People are building new modalities, new capabilities that are completely novel, interesting, and could be worrisome. So, there is this classic example. Well, classic, everything is moving so fast. So classic means last year. There is this example of Llama 2, I think, that was trained with guardrails. So the instructions were very clear. If somebody's asking you to do something dangerous, just flat out refuse. And this is training by, a well-resourced company, one of the best AI labs in the world. And they released this model open source. And when you and I would go and say, hey, tell me how to hotwire our car, the model will say no. Great. Well, what if you invest a little bit in fine-tuning, which researchers have done? They've fine-tuned and removed all the guardrails. And now you say to the model, hey, how do I produce a deadly pandemic? And it just gives you a list of 10 steps that you will undertake, and you will have a deadly pandemic at the end. Now, all of this information is not very different from what you might get from a very sustained Google search. So far, we're still sort of safe. But as models improve in capabilities and the community learns how to create ensembles of models, mix and match between capabilities, even models that were released and were initially trained and validated as safe may no longer be so in the future.
So you can use a shovel and turn it into a shank, for lack of a better phrase. So even the smallest tools can be used for destructive purposes. Chinny, we had this beautiful picture of a community garden just seconds ago, and docile shovels. What's your response to Yonathan's remarks? Should we be concerned about even the lowest level models or some of the lower level models being made open source? Or is this something where we really have to make sure we're aware of the costs and benefits of this approach? How do you think about this policy issue?
So again, kind of the theme of my answers is I feel like 20% along the path of really figuring out where I want to be on answering these questions. And so hopefully I can get us somewhere close to that. But I don't have a bulletproof answer. But I will say, I do think that I come at this from maybe the opposite side that Yonathan does. And to your first question, yes, we should absolutely be concerned about the risks of foundation models, even though I think that term is at this point functionally nonsensical, and I don't know what it means, and I don't know that anyone really knows what it means, besides something that can be used for a lot of different things. But that aside, I think that we should be concerned about powerful ones. I think we should be concerned about relatively simple ones. But I think that your community garden and shovel into a shank example is exactly right, in that we can't ban shovels because they can be turned into shanks. We can't ban knives because while we need them to, mince carrots for a sauce, that they can also be used for harm. The concept of dual use technology has been talked about for an extremely long time. My existential concern about the way the open source AI debate has been going is twofold. One is that it is treating open source AI as a monolith. I've not seen a lot of, and this is not for this conversation. This conversation has been amazing. In the broader public sphere, I have seen not a lot of distinction between whether people talking about data, code, or weights. I have not seen a lot of distinction in whether people are talking about things like TensorFlow, which are libraries that are used to help build open source AI, versus things like Llama, which is a trained and sophisticated model. I'm seeing people call things like ChatGPT open. ChatGPT is absolutely not open. I think that I am very concerned that there's a lot of fear mongering that is going to drive a lot of bad policy. I think that we've seen in the past that we have concerns when it comes to the export of code that we consider dangerous. Our trying to prevent that from happening has never gone well historically. We used to try to prevent strong encryption. We told the open source community, you cannot export strong encryption cryptographic tools overseas. So what did the open source community do? We built our strong encryption tools domestically, and we just had people that, happen to copy and build identical strong encryption projects overseas. But what did that lead to? It led to systems that basically had on-off switches for strong encryption. Oh, this is a version that's going to be in the US on, this is a version that's not, it's going to be off. But what does that mean? That ossifies in our internet architecture. Today, the relics of that time period, of that very bad policy, exists today. And that's a very simple example. If you have something like an open source project that all of a sudden we say this is not allowed to be open anymore, that's going to change the very fundamental architecture of the internet. I am concerned about that from a very practical, how do you even enforce this standpoint? My second concern is I do not see enough people talking about how the fact that we wouldn't have AI at all today, but for the open source community. The reason AI has been able to grow to the place that it is today is because for decades and decades and decades, largely researchers and academics in labs have been working on these technologies, collaborating across countries in ways that have allowed us to have the toolkits that allowed Google to kind of create a set of tools that then OpenAI later took to build ChatGPT. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, but not just other companies that we have licensed contracts with, open projects that have existed. There are right now PhD students across the country that are using this not just to build the next cool AGI, but also to do research in, this is an example of Llama. How could we build something that could measure in an empirical way the bias in Llama's outputs? How could we build something that allows us to create an auditable sort of record of Llama's decision making? Researchers need access to the tools themselves to be able to do that kind of work. I mean, I can't say enough about how important the open source community is to that kind of information gathering. It's not just about building the next cool thing. It's also about protecting us from the next cool thing. All of that requires openness. It's accountability. It is having more eyes on a problem so that we know that the problem exists and we can hopefully try to fix it. And then the third concern I have here is I'm not seeing a lot of empirical data that suggests that the availability of open foundation models is creating any new risk that does not already exist in the world of harm that exists on the internet. Yes, it is horrible that with one click, I can create a large series of compromising, exploitative images about a person using generative AI technology. However, at scale, is that meaningfully different from the way you could pay someone cents on the dollar to do the exact same thing on the dark web before the open availability of image generation tools? They're in researching this and in asking a lot of questions. I have yet to find a compelling study that says that the rise of deepfakes and disinformation and misinformation is exacerbated to a meaningful degree by open models. A lot of this is being done by closed models, totally permissible, contracted, licensed, sanctioned as approved by capitalism models. What new and additional harm is the availability of open models doing that our ability to explore the dark web couldn't get us before? In terms of the creation of bioweapons, it is absolutely terrifying to imagine that bioweapons could be generated using generative AI. And of course, that's a possibility. That is absolutely possible to do with proprietary models, which is why trade secret and economic espionage have been on the books for decades as laws. And we have huge national security efforts towards trying to prevent nation state adversaries from stealing proprietary information that would allow them to build these things. Is the fact that, and for example, North Korea might have access to an open source model going to be a game changer overnight in their ability to create a bioweapon? I don't think so. I think that there's still going to need to be human expertise there that they need to get either by recruiting assets from another country or training people internally, lab resources, dissemination protocols. I mean, you can have the idea, but you can't execute it without more resources. And there are other ways for us to measure anomalous behavior that could protect us against that potentially happening. This is kind of my concern on the open source debate. I agree that there are concerns about how easy it is today for people to do bad things online. I don't think that that is the fault of the open source community or the collaboration on open source tools. I think, and this is my refrain most of the time, it is the fault of our break things and move fast culture that has allowed companies with the stamp of approval of capitalism to release products into the wild, to acculturate the public to those products and say, this is now this is a part of our day-to-day society. We all are entitled to these technologies. We should all get used to these technologies. And now we can all use these technologies for bad things. Anyone can turn a shovel into a shank. Anyone can turn any technology tool into an extremely harmful technology tool. And to existential threat, it takes but a few lines of code. We saw this with the Log4 shell crisis. You don't need open source AI to take down an entire power grid, to take an entire government systems offline. Iran had for 4+ months access to highly sensitive classified information from the US military servers because the US government failed to patch an instance of Log4j on their servers. This is not AI. This is rudimentary logging code. End tirade.
Wonderful tirade. I think the important point here is to see this concept of marginal risk. Obviously, before the introduction of AI, people were doing bad things with commonly disseminated tools. And now we add AI, people are still finding ways to do the same bad things with commonly disseminated tools. Yonathan, we had a lot of concerns there about being perhaps overly regulatory with respect to open source. What is your pushback? Why might we instead want to adopt a posture of being a little bit more preemptory with respect to the dissemination of open source models?
Yeah, okay. So Chinny raised a lot of great points, and there are many there. So maybe I can address a couple, and then maybe we can think more about what needs to be refined further. But just sort of the outset, I think you put it very well by talking about marginal risk, where we are starting to see across the economy a productivity bump. AI will have an influence being deployed. It's very clear that productivity is going to go up. Exactly how much is debatable, but it is very clear that workers who use ChatGPT can become more efficient, more effective. I can say it from personal experience. I became a much better coder since GPT-4. And as the models become better, so am I becoming a better coder. So all of that we're seeing across the economy, and it is obviously a corollary that when you're a terrorist organization and you're limited and constrained in your resources, one of the things you lack is maybe, expert manpower. And if you get to have 50% less of your budget going to research and you can use it to buy better lab equipment, well, that increases the risk marginally. We don't live in a great world where there are no risks, and now AI is introducing the first set of risks, obviously. And obviously, sort of the digital economy, information technology has introduced vast amounts of new risks. But relative to that, AI will still make a great difference. Now, there is something that I think gets lost in this beautiful garden shovel becoming shank example, which is the notion of multiplicative risk. That is, risk that grows and sort of explodes in its scope, because with our shovel shank, you can only shank, I guess, a couple of folks, which really you shouldn't. But the risks here are, at least if you believe the risk profiles that people outline, are vast in magnitude. And so we think, well, do we want to let our adversaries have access to these models? Now, one thing that Chinny said very correctly is, hey, you can do a lot of bad stuff with proprietary models, like GPT-4o or the new Claude 3.5. These are great models, and they accomplish more than any of our open source models. Yes, agreed. We need to control and regulate and be careful. We have a paper on the systemic regulation of AI with Matt Toxin and Albert Lin, when we say we need to think about this systemically, not just about the way people use it, but have sort of an overview framework for regulating AI. And yes, definitely we need to start with the more powerful systems, which implies tighter regulation of the sort of super big companies and the frontier AI labs. Granted, after we have done that, we also need to worry about the open source community, not because necessarily it's full of malicious people. There are many amazing people who are part of this community. Nonetheless, if we are releasing without any sort of control over the models to our greatest adversaries, it's very strong models, what will happen, we don't know. And even with the Second Amendment, we think that there are some limits, some types of weapons that we don't want to open source and release publicly. Another example would be gain of function research, which we think is something that when scientists are developing variants of viruses that can be deadly to humans in order to understand them better. So they're motivated by safety concerns, but we think this is so utterly dangerous that has to be tightly controlled. So even though there is some safety implications, there is some safety benefit to gain-of-function research, there are also great dangers, and we think that this should be tightly monitored and regulated. And so the case for regulating open source is perhaps maybe weaker on the margin relative to proprietary models, but it doesn't mean that there is no very strong case, in my view, to regulate them.
So moving on to our lightning round, I would love to get y'all's opinions on SB 1047. SB 1047 is a bill currently making its way through the California state legislature that regulates AI at the model level. In other words, with respect to open source, it means that a company that releases an open source model may be liable for the actions taken by end users. Now, there are some amendments being considered, and there's a little bit more nuance there, but I would love to get y'all's opinions initially on whether this is the right approach to regulating open source models. And happy to go into as much detail as you'd like. Chinny, let's start with you.
I mean, this is me just kind of punting the question back to you, but do you mind explaining a little bit about how exactly the California bill is proposing to put liability at the model level?
The general idea, without getting too far into the weeds to continue our great community garden metaphor, the general idea is that if a model causes a certain threshold of risk, either $500 million in damage to critical infrastructure or mass casualties, then the creators of that model would be responsible for that damage, regardless of who used the model to cause that damage.
I mean, so right off the bat, and I know that I'm inviting like rotten fruit and stones to be thrown at me saying this, but I hate that. I instinctively hate that with every fiber of my being, because my first paper was on open source and security. And I cannot understand a world in which we say somebody wrote something and put it up on the web and said, I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying you should use this. I'm saying that this does something, I don't know, see if it's helpful. And somebody else looks at it and says, I'm going to use that, and then takes it and subjects the rest of the world to it by actually using it in a public facing way. And then it causes harm. Why should the responsibility be on the entity that put something up there, put it out in the ether? I mean, the comparable kind of physical world corollary would be like, it's in an incubator, it's in a lab, and somebody else took it out and was like, nope, I think this is ready for real time. Let's go. And the responsibility goes on the person that just kind of came up with the idea and said, it's here. If you want to kind of try it, do something with it. No, I think the responsibility should be on the party that took it and said, this is ready for game time. This is ready for real time. We're going to use this in a way that this is going to impact real people in the public. That I strongly believe that. I do not, whether it makes, we can have political theory conversations on enforceability and which choke points are more efficacious for us to be kind of influencing behavior. But no, I think the responsibility is on somebody that took a model and said, I'm ready to use this. I'm ready to expose other people to the risk that this introduces. I don't think that by putting an idea on the internet without any real world application is introducing risk. I think that that's putting out an idea. I can put out all sorts of half-baked ideas on the internet. The minute somebody else adopts them, that's when we introduce risk.
For the record, no tomatoes or other fruits or vegetables were thrown at Chinny for that statement. Yonathan, what's your response? How do you think about the right actor to hold responsible for the risks associated with open source models?
First, I love fruits and vegetables. So if something is being thrown here, I'd appreciate it going my way. My own view is that I think this is sort of a step in the right direction, but maybe not even going far enough. So the bill is targeting models that can cause incredibly significant harm. And moreover, it doesn't even apply to existing models. It applies to models that will be created, I think, this year or maybe next year, but it still doesn't apply to any specific models. So what it basically says, well, if you have a model that can cause mass casualties, that can cause at least $500 million of damage, or it can cause, allow people to build chemical weapons, then how about you being a little bit careful, testing it, making sure you're not releasing something utterly dangerous? And the reaction to that has been very, very strong. People have said, you know what, that kills all AI innovation, that kills the open source community. Well, first, a clarification. It doesn't apply to open source models, at least effectively not. And we can go into the details a little bit more. But then I think that this is a very mild requirement. If somebody is building something so utterly dangerous that we will ask them to make sure, let's make sure it won't cause mass casualties, then I think it is a proper requirement. And it's further, another requirement of the law is that the model will be shut downable, that there is some way to say, we messed up, we made a mistake, there is huge harm being caused. Now, the unit of analysis has to be, at least in part, the developer, because it is possible with open source models to use them anonymously, to use them outside the United States. Our ability to enforce against people who use them for evil is extremely limited. Not to mention the fact that the models themselves may behave in a way unintended by its developers, but nonetheless not prompted by any specific user, that will produce mass harms, at least according to some theories of how these models might work. In all of these circumstances, it will be utterly reasonable for us to require some modicum of oversight and optionality, the reversibility, the ability to say, we made a mistake, please someone press the red button. And if there is no red button, because the model is already disseminated across the earth, and North Korea is now employing, various version of Llama 7 in a dangerous way, then we're in trouble.
I agree with a lot with what Yonathan said. I think that my question, and this is always what it is, we have 3 lawyers on the call, is, the devil's in the details here. If I create an image generator, a very powerful image generator, and I make that available to the world, and with some quick modifications, because it's open source, somebody can turn that into an incredibly horrific CSAM generating machine, removing my guardrails or whatever, then that's a very tricky question on who built the model versus who introduced the harm. Mm-hmm. And what we're talking about are general purpose technologies where it is very easy to take anything that could be built in the most useful, well-intentioned way that we would all consider, for example, security research. We would want more small businesses to have access to models that can do scanning on their systems to identify instances of malware or other sorts of cyber attacks. Those can also be reverse engineered to, in fact, create cyber attacks. So at what point does the liability attach to the original model developer when its original purpose has been subverted through minor changes? And those changes are what is permissible under open source. That's the point of it.
There have been some additional language changes to the bill, adding some idea of when a derivative of an open source model now removes liability from the original developer. But with all those technical weeds, we are going to have to leave it there and let folks get to their gardens. Thank you to you both for joining.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, Chinny.
Thank you, Yonathan and Kevin. It was wonderful to join.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osban of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.